This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
Jerk DMs. Get a better DM.
Savage.
Sorry.
Third edition had to stop.
I remember hearing the CEO of Wizards of the Coast. I was actually in the room when I heard this happen. He was interviewing.
I was one of the playtesters of 4th edition. And when it came out, yes, it's my fault. This 6th edition, whatever we're going to call it, it's already moving in a direction that worries me.
I'm not excited.
It's better than only Shawn gets to test it and then we get 4E again.
I mean, Wizards of the Coast do gotta watch it a little bit.
No way would Jeremy Crawford during an Acquisitions Incorporated game stick to those kinds of rules. It never worked. Why? I'm not going to mention them because people yell at me. I have lots of thoughts.
This is going to be a juicy one, I can tell.
Would you like fries with that?
All that and more right now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 D&D podcast in all the planes of existence, in all editions of D&D, including our new editionless future that Wizards is trying to present to us with One D&D. Yeah, right. We'll start calling it 6th. I feel like we need to start calling it 6th edition to seize back the mantle of editions. My name's Ben Byrne, and I am here as always with Shawn Merwin and Dael Kingsmill, and joined special guest, the lazy Dungeon Master. Sorry, I almost said Game Master.
No, it's not an insult. That's good.
Mike Shea, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a delight. I'm a big fan of the podcast. It's awesome.
Oh, thank you so much. I really, really do appreciate that. I have a question for you, which is to ask, before we jump into the juicy news, what is your favorite advantage of playing tabletop RPGs online as opposed to in person?
I'm going to jump to maps. Handling maps is so much easier online than it is in person. It's so bad that I played in person for decades, and all my weekly game and everything was in person. And then COVID hit, and I immediately went 100% online. And I just this is a terrible situation, but it's really interesting to just relearn how to do D&D. And then I played for 2 years online, and then went back to in person. And I'm like, I don't know how to do maps. I have no idea. How does anybody do maps? How did we ever do it? How did we manage to play D&D before? I don't even know, because it's it seems so ridiculous. Hand drawing maps, what is that? That's crazy town. So yeah, I'm running a Curse of Strahd game for Halloween. I'm running every Halloween I run Ravenloft, a quick one session version of Ravenloft, and we were should we do it in person this year? And I'm nah, let's do it online. It's so much easier to do the map, because Ravenloft is 38 levels. It's nuts. So maps, I'll go with maps as the easiest thing to do online.
Do you find you're sort of semi-preferring online play to in-person? Is that your go-to more often now?
No, I actually, having now gone back to in-person play, I'll deal with the map problem. And I much prefer playing online because of body language and lack of lag, and the interaction and the connection to players, to my friends around the table is way stronger in person than it is online.
Yeah, absolutely.
Playing online with my friends is great too, and having that option is fantastic.
Yeah, it is such a great option, but coming back from playing online for almost a year, the first game that I sat in person, I remember feeling just the atmosphere again, kind of missing that X factor that comes with a sort of in-person tabletop RPGs. But Shawn Merwin, I have to ask you, what is your favorite advantage of playing tabletop RPGs online?
I would have to say getting to play with people that you wouldn't be able to play with otherwise. I am also not a big fan of online play, but being able to play test something quickly without having to go through and schedule everything has been a great benefit. Getting to play with people in different continents, is sort of fun.
That is true. That's very fair.
I like his answer better than mine.
I don't know. I probably would have said yours to be all honest. Being
with more people is far stronger than handling maps.
Dael Kingsmill, bringing it home for the opening question of this episode. Your favorite advantage of playing online?
It's funny because I feel like I'm going to have to say that it's both maps and being able to play with people on different continents. I feel like those are the two big things, right? I get to play with people I never would get to play with otherwise. And I don't think that there is a table in existence that is actually good for playing tabletop RPGs. There's no space, right? You either don't have enough space for your papers and stuff, your character sheets, or you have enough space for that, and so then the map has to be sort of all the way in the middle of the table where no one can really reach it to do anything with the tokens or the minis. And it gets like, even watching Critical Role, right? Matt Mercer has just given up on anyone moving their own tokens, and they just have to try and they have like pen lights and stuff to try and guide where they want to stand. I don't think that there's any table that can actually accommodate. They have the best one possible.
Imagine, right? Exactly. Critical Role spent like $1 million on that studio. They had 3 different like design companies come in and build it, and it's still like, I can't be bothered to go reach my mini.
We're still bound by physical reality. What is this curse?
You know,
and then, I mean, on top of that, you think about how the coolest tables now have like a TV inside the table so that you can do the digital maps just on the table without having to worry about it.
I would slightly fight you on that, only because my dining room table, which I've had since, like I've taken it from my house when I was a teenager. It's like a 10, 15-year-old dining room table by this point, but it is like the perfect 5 by 5 foot square that has one side for the Dungeon Master and then another side for 2 players each for 6 players. It's perfectly sized for your grid in the middle and then your character sheets around the outside. My bane is snacks. Is just like putting down the grid and the minis and it all just getting lost behind like chip packets and, you know, chocolate and all that sort of stuff. At some point I made a rule
that the snacks have to be on a separate table because they take up space, they get on everything, and everyone's distracted the whole time trying to find food. And it changed everything. Making people go and get a plate of snacks and bring it back changed my life. It was the greatest thing I've ever done. But Ben, that is a bold claim because I am within physical reach of viewing your dining room table and proving you a liar. So
well, you can come play D&D with us and you can find out, although that would make the group 7. But one of them is frequently not there, so it might work. Joey played D&D with us, so I'll get the whole Lorecast on eventually.
Speaking of snacks, one of the greatest online stories I have about playing is we're playing along with our group and we're in the middle of the combat and all of a sudden it's one of the gentleman's turn who we play with and we say, Steve, it's your turn. What do you want to do? And we hear, would you like fries with that? He was playing at a drive-thru. He had left his house, gone through a drive-thru to get dinner, and we had no idea.
That's it. That's the real benefit of online play, right?
Yeah, there you go. You can do it anywhere.
Mac is run.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, speaking of playing D&D online, Wizards of the Coast have recently released online their latest rules update for what they're calling One D&D. We're editionless now. All D&D is the same D&D, although this, to me, as someone who wasn't there, admittedly, smells a lot like 4th edition for specific reasons. We have thoughts. I have thoughts. You all have thoughts. So let's think together about One D&D. I did put this in a rough order to kind of like talk about the classes, talk about the feats, talk about the spell list, kind of in that order, because that's the order it's laid out in the PDF. But I'm happy to pick up if anybody wants to pick up. They've got somewhere they're burning to sort of start talking. I'm happy to pick up there.
Can I argue with your hypothesis about 4th edition?
Oh, you can school me because, like I said, I was not there.
Yeah, so Shawn and I were there, and there was no playtest of 4th edition. So it was like there was a meeting, there was like an announcement at Gen Con, and then like
they dropped people in that without
7 months warning. 7 months later, it was like, here it is, and out it came. And I think there was some it wasn't play testing, but I think there were some like sample games. No, let me change that. There was no public play testing. Like Shawn, I can tell he's already gonna, and there was no public play testing of 4E, and suddenly it was out. And so at least like we have all, I have lots of feelings, and lots of people seem to have lots of feelings about it. But our feelings are 2 years before the books are coming out. So that to me is a significant difference with how this is going and how 4th edition went.
I suppose like my comparison to 4th edition, and it is a very specific comparison, so it's not like I think they're recreating that whole system, but I'm just going to start picking up with not just the feats themselves, but the way that feats have been worked into the classes in this latest update, which is to say that feats have gone from like an optional part of 5th edition, optional as we've learned in heavy quotation marks, to becoming a fundamental part of One D&D's design in terms of, even ability score updates or ability score upgrades are now like a feat that you plug into the character. There's prerequisites for feats. There's feats that now cool down on initiative rolls. Which smacks a lot like encounter powers to me.
Right.
That was the thing specifically that I saw, and I was like, "Oh, that seems familiar."
That was really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like they're trying to pull. There's a customizability to the game, but bringing in feats and kind of having lots of opportunities to plug these into your character. But it also feels very gamified compared to how 5e wants you or suggests that you build a character. Thoughts on feats?
I have lots of thoughts.
Please get us started. Get us rolling.
So it's really interesting that all of the feats have now become 1.5 feats. And it's like the default is every feat, like Warcaster, I don't think they changed anything about Warcaster, although now it gives you an ability score bump. And that to me is a huge change, that every feat became a half feat. And what does that mean for the rest of the game? What does it mean that not only are feats no longer an optional thing that you sort of, an optional class that almost everybody used, like, all the DMs I pulled, they used, almost all of them use feats. But now not only is it baked in to the game, but now it also, there's like, well, we don't want people to not get ability score bumps when they're using feats. So we're going to give you, an ability bump as well. And by the way, we're giving you feats at first level, and we're giving you a feat at 20th level, and we're moving the 20th level power to 18th level. They've like the power range of characters has now condensed on both directions. And what does that mean for the whole rest of the game? Like, what, does challenge rating still mean what challenge rating meant before? I don't know. I don't know what any of this means.
It's interesting because it means that now players have a lot more options, which I have thoughts about that'll come up in a minute, and I'm sure will come up again when we start talking about spellcasting. But it gives characters and players a lot more options, but it kind of, in a weird way, it's less of a choice, right? Like before it was really, as long as the DM said, yes, feats are allowed because it was optional, but as long as feats were in play, there was a genuine choice. Do you want this ability score increase, or do you want to take a feat? Or if you want to play it half-half, you can take a half feat. They exist, Whereas now I guess the ability score increase feat exists for if your ability scores are on an even number and you don't want to wait for the modifier bump. But the rest of the time, it's a no-brainer. Take a feat. You're going to get an ability score increase anyway, which is fine. It's it sort of leads to quicker character progression, but and I'm sure a lot of people will be stoked about that. But I think that it has done an interesting things in terms of options v choice.
I agree. It's the same reason I prefer point buy to rolling for stats, is to get a more even kind of starting stats for a character, so that at level 4 or whatever other ability score increase level you're at, it is a choice whether you take the ability score increase and buff a bunch of things, or you take the feat instead. It feels like, and I thought this with the last Unearthed Arcana they released as well, with the natural 20 always counts as a success and different things that they were doing. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, even though it might come off a bit curmudgeonly, but it feels like they're very geared towards the players as opposed to the game masters' enjoyment of the game. Like, just give them everything they, yeah, sure, have feats, have ability score increases, buff your character to exactly what you want them to be early,
I mean, it's not that they didn't do anything for DMs. They did take critical hits away. But granted, they gave it back, so I won't.
Yeah.
They gave it back. That doesn't count.
I know.
Well, the big question I have when I read these is, who are they marketing this game for? Right. Every edition, one of the benefits of a new edition has always been, we're going to make the game simpler than it is at this moment, so new players will be able to come in. And this is the first time where I feel like the new edition will not be as nice for new players as the previous edition was. And I'm not sure if this is because we have third-party publishers out there making more complex versions of 5e, which certain segments of the player base want. And Wizards is saying, well, we saw Pathfinder go super complex. We've seen these other games go super complex. So we are now going to bump up the complexity of the game to serve a certain audience, and we'll find a way somehow to keep it available to new players, whether it be a different sort of game or a basic edition or something like that. This makes me wonder if that's in the plans as well, when I see complexity being added with a new edition.
Well, I mean, not to cross the streams too much here and talk about feats and spellcasting at the same time, but that's kind of what I was interested in talking about there, because you see J. Craw in this video introducing the new playtest material, specifically saying something like, spellcasting is really daunting for new players, so we want to simplify that by offering, here are the spells that you should take. You don't have to be overwhelmed with the choice, right? And then when you go to the actual playtest and you see, oh, everyone's a prepared caster now. Everyone's a prepared caster. We have more cross-referencing of spell lists than we had before, and we had plenty of it before. It's a bit jarring to see that is part of the ethos of the design they want to go with for One D&D. But it seems to me like it clashes with the implementation that we're seeing. Because I like the distinction between prepared casters and spontaneous casters. That is something that I like because it gives you a flavor difference between a wizard and a sorcerer. But if I had to pick one of those things in order to make the game simpler for new players, I think spontaneous casting is a simpler thing to understand.
Well, that confused me too. I did not listen to any of the discussions from the developers because that's marketing. I want to see how it actually plays out. And so when I was reading over the spellcasting, I'm like, okay, wait. So now you're preparing spells, and there are spell slots, but they're the same thing. There's slots, and so that made me think, wait, are we going back to like AD&D now, where you actually have to prepare each and every spell? And you can't switch out.
I have 4 magic missiles prepared.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I was like, no, they can't be doing that. And then there was a small clause in there that said the number of slots is equal to the number of prepared. And I'm like, oh, okay. At least they said that. But I had to read it 3 times to find that small phrase.
And I don't know. We'll see how they end up with this. But I had a player who I played with for like 5 or 6 years, and 6 years in, I realized was never doing spell slots, like never actually kept track of spell slots at all, and just cast whatever spells they had prepared. And when I was like, haven't you cast like 5 5th level spells? And he's like, well, yeah, I have it prepared. I'm like, hang on, that's not how this is supposed to work, right? But it was like years that they played, and before they understood how spell slots and prepared spells worked. So yeah, I mean, like that's probably an area of complexity that they could spend a good amount of time on, while they're also not increasing the complexity by saying, hey, by the way, as a human, you have to pick 2 feats. The simplest race that you can choose in D&D has twice the complexity of every other one because you have to pick 2 feats instead of 1, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know.
And to pick good feats, you have to understand what each one does, how that interacts with the system, how it's gonna. It's so many choices. And someone has pointed out in chat, and they are correct, that suggested spells were provided. And I actually think that's not a bad thing. It's something that I will never use, but that's great for people. But I don't necessarily love the way that it was implemented either. Once again, it's like, this is a fine idea. Hate what's happening with it. Because having several features say, these are your spells. Or alternatively, if you want to, you can pick them, but you have to do this, this, and this, and this. And it makes choosing seem super complicated.
Yeah, I agree.
Which again, for new players means that you're gonna look at that and you're gonna go, oh, well, I wanted this spell, but I guess that sounds like it's gonna be really hard. So I'll just take the ones that they tell me I have as default.
Well, it's not just that. There are spells within the player's handbook that like players will pull out, and 90% of the time I'll recognize it, probably know what it does if it's a first, second, or third level spell. But every now and again, there's a player that pulls out some obscure 2nd level spell, and I'm like, I have never heard of that spell. Is that a Tasha's spell? Is that like in one of these other supplements? And it's just because it's not one of the kind of optimized spells that most players tend to choose. And so I wonder if they've just kind of created, I haven't looked at it closely enough to know the answer to this, but whether they've just created the optimized path and that's all you're really going to see is those standard spells with people choosing one or two that happens to be their favorites.
Yeah, I don't think we can really know until we see the spellcaster playtest packet, right? Like right now we're just looking at rangers and bards, and rangers are half casters, and you know, I don't know what bards do. I never knew what bards do, but like, you know, they're not real spellcasters.
Well, rangers
real spellcasters.
They're more spellcasters now than they used to be. Rangers now have cantrips and they get their spellcasting from first level.
That's true.
Which
really
is funny.
quick, because this is not a discussion point, but I just want to get it out there. It drives me up the wall that throughout the playtest they keep swapping between cantrip and 0-level spells. Why are you doing this?
Yeah, I noticed that as well. I couldn't find the word cantrip in there after I started noticing the 0-level spell. So I'd wondered if they'd done away with that. But I know that you did a video recently, Dael, kind of
I didn't even notice
thoroughly sort of restructuring some of the classes of 5th edition and stripping magic out of the ranger altogether. And that's interesting because I've had players at my table who go, I want to play a ranger, but I don't want to play a spellcaster. I don't want to play a mage. The Monster Hunter, which I wrote, was kind of a specific response to that of a non-fey, non-magical feeling hunting wildernesser, right? So it's interesting that they've... Well, that's true. That's fair. But the fighter is like water. And sometimes you want Pepsi or Coke, you know? Like, the fighter's really good at hydrating you for fighting.
You were going to say something actually design-based. I genuinely thought you were going to say, you know, the fighter's really versatile, whereas this is more specialized. And then you were like, water and Coke.
No, the fighter is the military strategist, but the fighter's not a witcher. Like, Aragorn could be made, like, you could argue that Aragorn's a fighter, but he's kind of not. He has some specialized skills that the fighter doesn't. Is he?
Yeah, he heals. He heals. What's her name at the end of Return of the King?
He does do that. Well, I have good news for you, Mike.
He's got healing word.
When I rewrote it to be a non-magical class, I did make a spellcasting subclass to fill that niche, so we can still have Aragorn.
It might be a feat, right? It might be a feat too that he has.
Might be a feat.
He's got that the medicine feat.
Everything could be a feat now.
Spellcasting initiate. He's taken cleric or whatever it happens to be.
Witcher's also cast tons
of
spells.
He has some kind of spellcaster background. You know, he grew up in Rivendell, so he knows some elf spells.
How do we feel about speaking of spells, the spell lists being codified? There's a lot of sort of codification, classification of the classes, the spell lists, kind of like a lot of keywording in this rule set as if to make rules much more specific rather than sort of wibbly wobbly, which they can sometimes be in base 5th edition. Do we feel good about the primal, the pre-steal and I'm sure it's called something
the
divine.
pre-steal. That's
They should have. I'm putting that in my feedback. It really should be pre-steal.
Yeah,
Thank you, Shawn.
Divine exists in 5th edition.
How do we feel about that? Is that a good change? Is that
I have to see the caster. I have to see the caster playtest to really get a handle on how they handle that. Totally.
Right. You want these categories to mean something if they are going to be used. It should clarify the game rather than obfuscate and confuse. So if you're really going to use it, it needs to be really used. If it's just something that's there and every once in a while we'll mention something about it, but half the time we're going to ignore it because you can cross over, it doesn't do anything for me. So I understand why it's there, but like Mike said, until we see the full rules for it, it's hard to say whether it's useful or just one more thing that is going to add confusion to the game.
It's like another tag, right? We already have circles. We already have sort of the domain of a spell, and now we also have to have this. It's like a lot of different ways to categorize a spell.
And I mean, look, I'll be reactionary. I'll base all my thoughts on what we saw of the bard and nothing else. No, we definitely will have to wait to see the spellcasting packet. But from what we see in the Bard, right? Here's where I start to get worried about, because I was really on board with the idea of it. I was really on board. But then you look at the Bard and they've had to specify further than they ordinarily would, right? Ordinarily, you could just say, choose a spell from the Bard spell list. That's how 5th edition worked.
Yeah.
And there were, finicky little intricacies with that. But now you have to say, okay, the Bard chooses from the Arcane spell list, but they have to be spells that are illusion, enchantment, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Now you have to limit it by school. And so now I'm cross-referencing the list with the spell school.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you get magical secrets, which, now feels a little bit lackluster to me, just to be like, oh, well, now you can choose from this other very large spell list, which... I don't know. It doesn't ultimately make an actual mechanical difference. It's really just a taste thing. It's the spice has gone out of it a little bit. But for me, the biggest thing is the cross-referencing. I feel like I wished on a monkey paw. I feel like so many things that I was excited to see. I would mention, this seems like a good idea. The idea that everyone can cast ritual spells now. Yeah, sure, why not? Like, yeah, that sounds great. And then they're like, yes, because they're all prepared casters. Okay. And then, let's have these 3 broader categories of spells so that we don't have individual spell lists for every spellcasting class. Great, that sounds like a great idea. And they were like, yes, but actually you have to cross-reference even more. The monkey paw hates me.
Yeah. But doing that cross-referencing often put me off playing something like a Arcane Trickster or an Eldritch Knight, because it was like, you can choose from the wizard spell list, but you can only choose Evocation and I think it's Abjuration for the Eldritch Knight, which they're usually pretty self-explanatory, but sometimes, especially because... it's well documented that the player's handbook not having the spell schools in the spell list itself has been a bit of a pain in the butt. Kind of broadening out from there to the classes themselves, we've touched on the Bard a little bit with the classification of these classes as the experts, and the mages are the arcanists, I think, which is wizard, warlock, and sorcerer. And you've got the martial classes, which is monk, barbarian, fighter. And I think there's the priests, which is druids, paladins, clerics at this stage. I think that's every class I've covered the bases of.
Yeah, I think the marshals are called warriors. Am I remembering
yes,
that
I think
right?
you're right. Shawn, you did send me, or was it you, Mike, sent me the playtest for the character origins one. So I was looking at dwarf backgrounds. That's not right. So if I get things wrong, that's why. I'm blaming you. So how do we feel about that classification? Fair. Because that's a keyword that, again, I was about to say means nothing, but it doesn't mean nothing, because now they've given expertise to the ranger. But it also, there's feats that have the expertise tag attached to them as a prerequisite. And there's thoughts. I don't know how to close that question.
My answer is sort of the same as it was for the spells. It's having these classifications is great. If it explicates play, if it helps explain things, great. If it just confuses things even more, if you're constantly having to reference, well, I can't multi-class into the same, however you're going to use it, it needs to help things rather than confuse things.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't.
Also,
I don't know why. I mean, there's so much of this where I'm like, why are they trying to fix this? Like, this wasn't a problem that I had. Why are we trying to fix this? And I know it's like, because we like to sell books. But, I'm going to buy your new book anyway, even if it was just like you mash Tasha's into the player's handbook, I'd still buy it. So yeah. One of the things is like, the idea like, oh, hey, we can have levels for feats. And I'm like, really? Like, I didn't have to worry about that before. I've been playing for 8 years. I didn't have to worry about having levels on feats before. What are you going to do to those feats that's so crazy that the 12th level feat is going to be, bananas?
As far as I've seen, there's only 1st, 4th, and 20th level feats. Maybe right there's now, more coming, but...
Right, so we can assume, I'm making the assumption that they're probably going to put out 8th level and 12th level and 16th level feats or something like that. But like, what are you going to do with those feats that's going to be, I'll use the naughty B word of balance. Like, what are you going to do there where you're not like, hey, our power curve just shot through the roof, right? Like, I didn't feel like the feats needed to have any kind of levels restriction. I had high level characters taking toughness all the time. That was like the last feat you took was toughness because it's easy and it gives you tons of hit points when you're high level. So, and I think they're also using those class breakouts because they're going to have feats broken out that way of like, here are certain feats that warriors will use. But like, who cares? Like, most warriors aren't going to pick a feat that's meant for a wizard anyway. They're not, how many fighters took Warcaster, right? Like, you don't have to segment a feat because they're self-selecting, right? Certain characters are going to want certain feats. So you don't really need to define a feat as being, well, we want to make sure wizards don't take this feat. I mean, who cares if the wizard takes a feat? So I don't I don't know why we've added these extra delineations.
It's more cross-referencing.
Right, yes. It's more cross-referencing, and it's just, I didn't need it. Like, I've been playing, assuming that they're staying at all to what we've been playing over the past 8 years, like, we've been playing it for 8 years, right? And it's worked, and 5 times more people are playing D&D now than were when it started, and more people are playing now than have ever played before, and somehow they're getting it to work just fine. Why are we fixing things that, like, I try to stay cognizant of what the common concerns are with this game. I haven't heard anybody. It's like, what I really want are feats that are based on classes and feats that have level ranges. No one said that. So, I don't know where they're coming out with this.
I suppose, and I'd be interested to get, Shawn, your kind of view on this, because my hypothesis, the way, obviously nothing can be said definitively until more is released, but the way it seems to be trending is definitely in more complexity because there's more cross-referencing. There's a lot more, if you've got a bunch of feats in your character, there's a lot more, things, specific abilities that have a paragraph of text that your character can do. One of my players built a real toolbox, they describe them as, took a bunch of feats, Lucky was one of them in there, and they just found they never needed all those extra things that the character could do, and they never used them. Yeah, exactly. I have so many options here, but I'm just going to attack again. I don't know, whatever it happens to be. It feels like they're trying to turn character creation and character advancement itself into more of a meta game itself. It's fun to construct characters in the way that it's fun to construct a house, right? Well, if I take this feat, I can get this, and that can cross-reference over to there, and that'll buff this. Oh, but I can't take that because I'm not an expert or whatever it happens to be. Maybe I can do this instead. Shawn, you look like you're dying to say something.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the joys of D&D for I would say, significant number of players, hardcore players, is having the ability to make things and make characters that are different from other characters. So that's why we are seeing this. We are seeing this because there is a want of it out, not want as in lack, want as in desire for all of these options to let people make these unique characters, and for some of them more powerful characters. What the issue is, the balance, small b balance that has to be struck with the game, is that you don't want to make the game more complex while allowing people to go off and make 70 characters and never play the game. Because there are many players that do that. They make characters they're never going to play, or they play very rarely, but they just want to see how they can start this character at first level, build it up to 20th level, and see what they can do with it. And my fear is that they're going to cater too far to the people that want to build these unique characters at the expense of a game that's playable, because you still can only take one action, one bonus action, your move, and a reaction on your turn. Whether you have 5 things on your character sheet or 5,000 things on your character sheet. And if you put those 5,000 things on your character sheet, you're not doing service to the players that don't want that complexity. And maybe driving players away from the game that you have grown and want to continue to grow.
For sure. I mean, it feels like they're in a tough position, to try to speak to Mike's question a little bit. And this is going to sound like a statement, but really it's a question. It's a hypothesis, if you will, is that Wizards feel like they're in a weird spot at the moment. unlike when they were with 4th edition, which to my understanding was quite unpopular, 3.5 was very popular, but they wanted more than what it was doing in the numbers. So they tried these kind of revolutionary things at the time with both of those editions, so it seems retrospectively. 5th edition is the most popular the game's ever been, but that trajectory, as much as over the last 5 years it seems like it's only going up, that trajectory kind of can't last, right? They've got to bring something new out. They've got to bring, something exciting, something to really get the audience to be like, yeah, we're excited about this new thing. But what can you do? Like, they talk a big game about it being backwards compatible. This seems far less backwards compatible than the first playtest did. How can they change the game enough that it feels fresh and new and gets the audience excited without alienating their current audience who love 5th edition and the game that has been so popular? Like, it's kind of like, you're right, they've fixed it. This doesn't seem better. This just seems different. But the game they had was pretty good, like it had its problems, but it was pretty popular, if nothing else, So what do you do? Like,
I mean, I love what they did with exhaustion. Right. And
yes,
I
me too.
It's my favorite thing in there.
I will immediately just make that like, we're just doing that forever now. Right.
Yes.
Like, it's so great. Yeah. And I'm you can send hate mail to Shawn Merwin, but like I love what they did with Great Weapon Master and Sharpshooter. Like, those feats were problems, and tweaking those feats, and those you're like, okay, I can understand. Like, hey, it's a half feat. You don't get your insane amount of damage that you get to do with your 2-hand crossbow wielding guy that does 96 damage around, one of Shawn's theory crafters, right? That, I'm good with stuff like little things like that, but you can make these tiny tweaks and not fundamentally change stuff. The one thing, and it's like, I know I'm talking about like the last playtest packet more than this playtest packet, but like a lot of people were house ruling that you could start with a feat. So I can understand where that came from. Like, I understand that was like an idea. I still think like you could have just stuck that in the DMG and said, hey, for an optional rule, you want to play a little more powerful game, let players pick a feat at first level, instead of like, we're going to wire that right into the game. But I do go with like, well, designers weren't hired to not design stuff. Right, like they're designers want to design, and they have a lot of relatively new designers that have joined the team since the 5th edition came out, which means they also have a bit of not invented here going on, where that was the old team that made that stuff, and I've got big ideas that I want to put into this one, and they're gonna do, and like now's the time for them. Where new books are coming out, why don't we take a look at all of this stuff? But I'm still like, designing is one thing and playing is another. And having to teach people, like I'm running a playtest group, and I stopped them and said, like, are we still good doing this? Because like our rules are changing every 2 games because we play every other week. So like, are we okay with this? Because like, I don't know if we're gonna, hey, this time, inspiration's on a 20. Oh, now it's on a 1. And like, we're changing so often, like we're forgetting what the actual rules are. And will that happen when the game actually comes out? That you've got tons and tons of people who've been playing who go, oh, I thought it was this other way. Right. And it's going to be a lot of painful conversations.
Oh man, just really quickly on the inspiration on a 1. This is what I'm psyched about, right? So we've got these big things that are coming in, the drops of here's what classes might look like, here's class groups, here's subclasses, those are all changing, and those have me worried. But I mean, of course they're going to have you worried because they've started with the experts who they've literally said they take little bits from the other classes and class groups. And so we've just got these little breadcrumbs of what the other class groups might look like, but we can't know for sure until they do them. So we've started with the most scary of the class groups. But all that stuff is the stuff that takes the most design work behind the scenes. It's the stuff that'll take the most time to change if they decide to change it based on audience feedback. So the stuff that I'm trying to keep my eyes on with each of these new playtest packets is that sort of glossary of terms that they've said is going to change every time. And they'll say inspiration. Last time we talked about doing it on a 20. This time we're talking about doing it on 1, because they can change those quickly. And we've already seen that was a suggestion that came after that first round of playtest material. People were like, why would you get it on 20? What if you get inspiration iteration because you failed.
Give it to the people who rolled terribly instead of
exactly.
the people who
And it's nice.
well.
Yeah, it's nice to see that rapid iteration, that sort of, we've got the feedback, let's try it. We can try another thing next time, let's just see how it goes. So that's the kind of stuff I'm trying to keep my focus on. The other thing regarding complexity, Arpeggio in chat made a very good point, that they're wondering if they are comfortable adding all of the cross-referencing because they're banking on releasing the virtual tabletop and having D&D Beyond to be ways to allow players to easily keep track of that stuff, which is very 4th edition, Ben. You're absolutely right. And it does make sense if you start to consider it in terms of this, the popularity of 5e and why they would be, what new can they bring new people to the table with? We've got all the people to the table that we could possibly get now. What else could we change to give them new stuff? And a virtual tabletop that is sort of centralized from Wizards of the Coast could be that thing. And if they are putting a bunch of their eggs into that virtual tabletop basket, I think that we likely will see a lot more complexity with the rest of this playtest material.
Yikes.
It is like the great wheel of time is turning in a weird way. I've never felt it so viscerally before.
I guess I'm not terribly surprised because it does seem like, right, and Shawn can help me out with this thought that there was a good period of time in 5th edition's life where no one brought up 4th edition really, and then all of a sudden there was this resurgence of people who are like, oh, 4th edition has all of these great ideas that they threw out, and how come we don't have more of those? Some of them are like, yeah, that's true, and some of them I'm like, what are you talking about? It never worked. Why are you? I'm not going to mention them because people yell at me, but there's certain ones that are very, very popular, and I'm like, man, I was trying to make that stuff. I tried running it. I tried writing it. I tried designing it. I wrote it for Wizards of the Coast. I never got it to work well. I have dozens of articles on my site about how to try to get this thing to work, and none of them ever worked. And yet we're like, oh no, it's a great idea. You should do that. So it's weird that the 4E, a lot of love of 4E has kind of returned now, or it feels like it. I don't know if it's true, right? I don't have data on it.
It feels like it.
It feels like it, and I wonder, are they oh yeah, we'll bring in some of these things. Although I don't think I'm looking at the new playtest and seeing a lot of things that are more 4E like. Well, there's one. I'll pick on one because it drove me bananas, and it's still kind of driving me bananas, which was the new the influence action. And, all of the text that's there for the influence action used to be in the Dungeon Master's Guide as a guide for DMs on hey, here's a way that you could run NPCs. And the way you read it in this playtest is no, that's going to be an action that a player can take. And I'm like, well, you don't need me anymore, right? You've got your spreadsheet on how to have an NPC interact. Why am I here? And
also,
I feel like
DCs are really low.
I know. Well, there's only
the DCs
2.
Really low.
Right. And there's only 2. I had a player who tried to pull it off, right? Where they were about to fight some harpies, and she's like, I'm going to interact with them. And I'm like, go ahead. And I'm like, she rolled a 19. I'm like, yay, we still have a combat, right? And I just feel like you got another, you got the most complex computer we've ever known sitting on the other side of a table, and you're going to reduce it down to a 3-state switch of, if you roll less than a 10, they do whatever they want. I'm like, you have a dungeon master for a reason. And part of that is figuring out how they're going to interact based on what you say to them, not having this spreadsheet there. So, but that also felt to me like a sort of a 4E, because some of the reaction that I saw on Reddit and some posts and some other chats was, thank God we don't have to have the DM fiat anymore. Now we don't have to have, now we don't have to worry about jerk DMs where I roll a really good influence check and they're like, well, they hate you anyway, and they're going to still stab you in the face. And then I'm like, hey, get a better DM. Right? That you're not, but that savage. Also, I know, sorry.
And, we know what kind of a DM Ben is now.
So but the other part of it is that was kind of something that they did with 4E. I think my friends and I who were around 4E know that one of the design ideas was to normalize dungeon mastering, that we wanted to have it where the experience of the game would be roughly the same if you had a relatively inexperienced DM or you had a very experienced DM. And they had a lot of stuff like fighters that would mark creatures, and that creature had to attack the fighter instead of attacking other people, and a lot of forced movement in weird directions. And I was like, there were plenty of times where I'm like, I'll be downstairs playing PlayStation, you guys play, right? You guys are controlling the monsters, and deciding what they do, and deciding who's stunned, and deciding where they move. I don't need to be here anymore. And I felt a little like that with that influence action. I'm wondering and I think they're testing that, right? I think that, again, this is a play test, and I think they're like, hey, what if we did, what if we kind of moved some of the some of the things that were part of the core mechanic of DM describes the situation, player describes what they want to do, DM describes the check, player rolls a check, DM describes the result. Instead of having that very generic interaction that is very heavy on how's the DM going to react to the result of a roll, they instead have this codified, like, here's what will happen. And then what if they put that into exploration? What if they put that into travel? What if they put that into these other sections? And then there's like fixing. I know there's lots of people who want that kind of thing, but then there's also people like me who is like, well, that is limiting what I actually do at the table as a DM. And if I'm on the side of the characters, I love them as heroes. I don't think they want me limited. I think they want me to help build a really fun story for them. So,
Not to get too deep about it or anything, but like, this is why we will always have judges and juries, right? Because the thing that a human can do that a robot and a computer can't, at least in this, our modern age, we can judge. We can make judgment calls that are adjusted based on the spirit of a rule or a law. And a computer can't. It is bound by the letter of the law or the letter of the rules. And that doesn't mean that it's bad necessarily, but I do think that D&D largely is a game that has a lot of nuance that a human can very quickly conceptualize and understand that a computer will never be able to.
And we could, even with a computer, we could certainly do better than a 10 and a 20.
Please,
right? There's only three things that can happen in a conversation, right? They either fail, limited success, or total success. Like, no, you can do a lot more than that.
That was the whole skill challenge debacle, right? It was...
You said it. I didn't say skill challenges.
I know, but you were thinking it so loud that it actually came out my mouth. It was the skill challenge debacle of here is how you run a non-combat situation in D&D without with just die rolls, with no role playing. But I mean, at the end of third edition, there were so many rules and they were so convoluted and there was so much power creep, and there was the internet, which there wasn't at the in first and second edition. And when you get the internet involved, people are going to look at the easiest path for their character, the most powerful build, and they had, at least in first and second edition, you had to figure it out yourself. With third edition, you just went into the Yahoo group or the chat or wherever you were, and you had it all spelled out for you. And so you grabbed that and you went back to your home group table and you rolled that character out. Oftentimes not even understanding what you were doing and getting it wrong, but still having the most powerful. If one person builds the most powerful broken character, everyone has the most powerful broken character. So third edition had to stop. Fourth edition, as Mike said, tried to be the game that you could play without the dungeon master. I think part of it was because there was supposed to be a virtual tabletop to go along with it. That would make it easier to run that way. And it was a very fine, mechanical, balanced game. The math was a little wonky at times, but for the most part, it was a very sound role-playing game, tabletop skirmish game. But the D&D soul was sucked out of it. So that's why 5th edition went back to this soulful D&D game, but still had some of the rough edges that previous editions did that the DM was supposed to take care of, and can, if the DM is experienced and isn't bullied by players or isn't in social situations that make it hard to run the game well. So when I see this 6th edition, whatever we're going to call it, come out,
you said it,
and add more mechanics to it right from the start, it's already moving in a direction that worries me for the future of the game.
Yeah, so a very good friend of ours, and they're in the chat, but I'm not going to name them because I didn't get his permission to quote this, had a really, really good statement he made, which is, do we really think that designers are going to use these rules? Right? That, like, we watched Chris Perkins run a game where Patrick Rothfuss had 1/2 a hit point for a whole game, right? Do we really think that they're going to be limited by, oh, nope, sorry, you rolled an interaction, you did the influence check, and it's going to be... No way would Jeremy Crawford, during an Acquisitions Incorporated game, stick to those kinds of rules when he's running the game. They change the rules all the time. So, like, if they're not even going to use their own rules when they're running their own games, why would they codify them and expect them we would? Why not build a game that's friendly for the kind of games that we've watched them run? And the interesting thing is that was kind of the reaction that, different people had lots of different feelings about what 4E did and how it worked out. There was definitely a group of people who felt like that 4E removed a lot of agency from DMs. I had friends of mine, I was in games as a player for DMs who said, I don't want to run this anymore. Like, I want to go back. And there was this big resurgence of OSR and old school essentials and Dungeon World and Powered by the Apocalypse games and 13th Age and other games that became, Fate was getting really big, very big story focused games that had tremendous, both, I don't want to say like it's not a burden, but gave a lot of responsibility and a lot of the authority to the DM to adjudicate how the game was going to go. And those became really popular as a result of having a game that was very restrictive in what DMs could do. And if they go the other way, I think there'll be this other resurgence again where people are like, no, I liked it better when, you rolled a die and the DM adjudicated the results. So
what's
be very interesting.
Interesting that I guess over the weekend after these rules were released, I was, trying to talk myself down. But one of the things that I thought during all of that was I've been really on my soapbox recently about the folk element of D&D as a game. And I think that that's why there is inevitably growing pains when you're going through playtest material for a new edition, right? Or apparently not public playtest material for 4th edition, you just drop it there and they have to learn new rules, is the idea that for the most part, and I know that there are people who do learn the rules by sitting down and reading the rule book, but I think probably the majority of people learn it by watching someone else, right? You learn it because you watch Critical Role and you pick up on the rules. And then you read bits of the rule book to kind of fill in the gaps. You played at a table and you learned from your DM and you picked up the stuff that they did. Any number of ways that you absorb this information, like you would absorb information in an oral folk culture, right? And then suddenly you come in and you go, we're changing all the rules. So you actually have to stop and read them. And they are being engraved into stone as we speak. And so you have this disruption in the folklore of the thing. And you feel it. And that's an advantage that D&D has always had over indie games or, other publishers, is that you've got this strong lineage of generation after generation of DMs who learned from their DMs. And you can't do that when you release a new indie game and everyone has to stop and read the rule book. But when D&D comes out with a new edition like this, because it's 6e.
We're coining it here. Let's spread it to the rest of the internet.
Yeah, no one else has called it that yet, right?
Hashtag 6e.
Yeah. But, when you get this kind of a break in that folklore, you suddenly even the playing field a little bit. And Wizards of the Coast do got to watch it a little bit, not to sound threatening, but just because it gives this opportunity for a lot of people to break off and do something else, play something else, because they don't like the direction it's going in.
What if Matt Mercer doesn't like it? How much trouble are they in? Right? How much trouble are they in? And we're like, we think we're going to write our own RPG.
Yes, 100%, because they could. They have their publishing press now. They can do that if they want to do that.
Putting out their own RPG. Yeah.
That's my question. In comparing this to 4E, and I don't know if these are silly comparisons or not, but I sat down with Shawn a couple of weeks ago and had like an hour-long discussion around how 4E launched, because I became really interested in the industry side of 4E. And I was reading articles and all this, and it was interesting to step back and go and look for articles on the internet that were written around the time that 4E was being released, as opposed to, retrospectives that were written today. Because the tone is very different depending on when you read it. But something I started to note was that the conditions around the launch of this new edition are very similar in terms of you have a highly popular edition, but Wizards feel the need to publish a new edition or start to progress the game forward. but they're trying to keep as much of their fan base kind of together as possible into that new edition to avoid the splintering that happened with the jump from 3.5 to 4E, which launched Pathfinder, because 3.5 was wildly popular among its fan base. And so the conditions seem ripe if Matt Mercer or whoever decides, we're going to take what we can from 5e, legally speaking, and port it into this other game that's very recognizable, and we're going to call it the Taldore Storyteller's Guide or something like that. And then you have like a whole new branch of D&D that's kind of split off from this launch of a new edition. It just like the comparisons seem very ready to be made.
And I mean, keep in mind as well that Critical Role started, I believe, if I get this correct, it started as a D&D one-shot, maybe in 3.5, turned into a home campaign Pathfinder with, some homebrewed, racial stats and things for things that were lost from D&D. And then when they came back to live stream, they swapped over to 5th edition. And so they are clearly, as a group, very willing to change system. I just think that that's worth keeping in mind.
I like from the Twitch chat, the new game's called Matt Finder. I thought that.
I mean, I don't think they can avoid it. Like, I think, I was just mentioning in chat that like there's already companies who have made their own version of 5th edition. Like N-World Publishing put out Level Up Advanced 5e, which is a fully compatible but separate RPG that has all kinds of stuff. Just minutes before this show aired, I pulled up a product that they just put out, their Dungeon Delvers guide that they just put up as part of their Kickstarter. Did I just advertise a product from a competing game company? Sorry about that. So
take it back.
But
gift of gab.
So I don't think. I mean, like it already is happening. Like we're already going to see people who are like, it doesn't even. We don't even need One D&D to come out for people to go, I have other ideas about how I want to do this.
Sure.
And then they have the resources, they have the knowledge, they have the experience to go ahead and make their own version. Some will be popular, some won't. Probably none of them will be popular as D&D no matter what happens. But that doesn't mean that it won't fragment a community that had been pretty solidified around 5e.
Well,
so we'll see.
That's the damned if you do, damned if you don't situation that Wizards kind of find themselves in, right? You're right. Other people, whether it's Level Up or whether it's, the homebrew rules from Grimhollow, or whether it's like people find their preferences, their preferred supplements, their preferred flavors of 5e and get kind of drawn further and further away from the books that Wizards are necessarily publishing. Not necessarily exclusively so, of course.
Yeah, I just don't think they were in that much trouble. Like,
it's... I don't know. I think you're right, but like, what would they publish otherwise if they're not doing a new edition?
More book, a book about giants and Planescape and the 5 other books they put it. They have a book on their roster next year that looks like another's Tasha's, right? It looks like another book of rule supplement kind of stuff. We don't really know what's going to be in it, but I'm looking at that. I'm like, what the hell's going to be in that? When you're going to have a new version of the game? Like, are you going to put out a bunch of subclasses we can't use 6 months later? Like,
relevant for all of 5 minutes.
I think they genuinely could keep publishing new adventures and stuff, and people would buy them. I don't think that they were in trouble so much. I don't think the trajectory had swapped to downwards yet.
Sure.
Just based on my, outside looking in kind of, I don't think based on the chatter that it was at that point yet. The only thing, I know that I've already said it, but the only thing I can think of is that they're trying to get a lock on that online player base.
Yeah,
the hardest thing about D&D is getting a group together, and they're going, how do we get a lock on that? How do we get more people to buy it because they can get a group together? And the answer is playing online.
Never underestimate the power of corporate greed. And I don't say that about Wizards of the Coast directly.
I don't think you can underestimate it, right? Like,
I think it goes to Hasbro. I think Hasbro, who made action figures and toys and games, all of a sudden turned around after COVID and said, this Wizards of the Coast place is making a vast majority of our profit. Not our revenue. Well, yes, revenue, but profit, as in they are making lots of money while spending very little. Now we need to use that model for everything that we do at Hasbro. Hey, Wizards of the Coast, tell us how you did it. And as soon as Wizards of the Coast started telling them how they did it, the other people at Hasbro were like, well, you could improve your bottom line by doing this. Or you're giving away all of this money via the DMs Guild or via the Open Gaming License. I see $1 million Kickstarters going on. How much of that are we getting using our rules? None? Really? Well, let's see what we can do about that. And that's why I trust so many of the designers that I know at Wizards of the Coast to make a really great game. I don't trust the people behind the scenes saying we need to sell. It's not even books, right? Books are nothing. It's we need to sell subscriptions to this new virtual tabletop that we're doing so that people will then come to our new streaming service and watch all of our shows and play the video games that we're making, because video games make a magnitude, orders of magnitude more than these role-playing game books that we're selling, these paper things that people are still in love with for some reason. That's where I'm looking around going,
yeah,
I don't know.
Mr. Monopoly's coming for us.
I mean, there's also I think we can also, I've had this discussion many times before, that it's very easy to kind of, go to the model that corporations seek profit above everything else. But they are still being run by people who are just as, have bad cognitive biases as everyone else, and they're just as likely to make terrible mistakes or do things for irrational reasons, and so and some irrational things can be great. I mean, I think 5th edition came from an irrational choice, and that irrational choice, I remember hearing the CEO of Wizards of the Coast. I was actually in the room when I heard this happen. He was interviewing a friend of mine was interviewing him for a podcast, and he said, this was right when they announced that they were doing the D&D Next playtest, and they said we're going to not really publish any more 4th edition books, and we're going to have 2 years where we're going to do a public playtest. And my friend who was interviewing him said, but you're not going to make any money on D&D for 2 years. He goes, Magic will make the money, right? Magic will pay the bill. And that was his whole answer to it, was that he liked D&D enough that he was willing to let an entire other branch fund a 2-year playtest of a game, probably at the lowest point of, a very, very low point for D&D, where sales were very low, I think. Yeah. I mean, people can argue about it, but I don't think 4th edition was very popular at the end of 4th edition's line. And I certainly know it wasn't popular the next 2 years, because I think they put out 2 books in 2 years, during that whole playtest. And the irrational answer was, we're not going to squeeze it for trademark use. We're not going to brand. We're not going to just focus on branding. Like, that would have been the rational choice, was D&D as a brand is still really useful. It's just the RPG that's not really doing it. And instead they said, we'll go ahead and let them build a whole other game. We'll give the designers 2 years to build it, and we'll do a public playtest. And at the end, we'll also put it out in an OGL, right? We'll also put the results out in an OGL. Those were not necessarily commercially rational decisions. And they gave us the game that we have. I don't know if it'll be commercially rational decisions that lead towards the next version or not. We don't really know, I don't think. But we'll see. And I'm really hoping, I have this fantasy that we're all going to be running around and, yelling on podcasts and doing all this stuff while these playtests are coming out. And then 2 years will come by and the hand is just oh, wow, this is really good. It is. Turns out it actually does work really well with the old stuff, or I really like it. This is great. And I'm really hoping that happens, that we get it. And we're instead of being oh my God, I got to make my own, my own RPG, or wow, I love this, but all my friends, it's oh no, it's really solid. They took the good stuff from Tasha's, and they took the stuff that we love from 5e, and they put it together, and it worked.
Well, here's a quick question, because we are starting to run out of time, but around the process of the playtest itself and how effective it is, and how much Wizards are listening, because the natural 20 gives you a inspiration, and now it's a natural 1 gives you inspiration. I don't know if that's something they thought of themselves, and then when the fan base were mentioning it, they were now it's going to look like we stole it from the fan base.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if they already had that idea. They're smart people there, and that was very quick for people to come to that thought. So I wouldn't be surprised if they already had that.
But how do we feel this playtest kind of period is going to influence the final product in terms of creating the game that we want as an audience by and large. It's not going to be the game everybody individually wants. How much influence are we going to have in crafting the game? And is that going to result in the best game if you've got, what did they say? Something like 450,000 people, I think, gave feedback on the first Unearthed Arcana. I'm pulling that out of the back of my head, so maybe that's a wrong number. But, when you've got that many people giving feedback, is that what's best for the game? I mean, I suppose you've got designers that then, maybe I'm answering my own question. You've got designers that then, interpret that and plug that into the system itself. How do we feel about this playtest strategy that they're employing?
I will happily say that I'm sure that they do get good feedback, and I'm sure that it is helpful, but it is as much marketing as it is helpful feedback most of the time. Because, as Dael said, getting 4E dropped on your lap being such a strange new thing was one of the reasons why it did not do well. If there had been a public playtest of it and people had gotten used to it, I was one of the playtesters of 4th edition. So I know it did get playtested. And when it came out, yes, it's my fault, Mike, I'm sorry. So when it came out, I was like, this looks good. This looks like what we play tested. We had a lot of fun. Here we go. Whereas everyone else was like, this is the most different thing from what we just did. And there's no way I'm ever going to play this. And so, this is a marketing tool as much as it is a playtest tool to be able to ease people into accepting a new edition as opposed to fighting it.
Because I got to say, when I started playing 4th edition, just from my perspective, it was that folk element, right? It was Colville saying, oh yeah, we'll run this thing. We're doing a virtual tabletop. Boom, this is how it works, and explaining the rules, right? So it was that, oral learning. And then I stopped to plan my next level up, and I actually went to the book to read it. And I suddenly understood. I really enjoyed playing 4th edition, but I suddenly understood in that moment why people didn't like it, because reading it, you are dropped into the deep end with very different things, and learning that there was no public playtest for that boggles my mind, because it was very different. There's
no slow learning period.
Sorry, go ahead. Well, I'm really glad we are playtesting. Like I'm glad when we think about like how is it going. I'm glad we're doing it. Like I'm glad we're seeing it. It's better than not. It's better than them just doing it or making these huge changes and we had no idea. I bet it has 49% of the vote. Right. I bet that they'll look at it, I'm sure, but they're the ones in charge, and how they feel about it is also going to be probably a bigger influence than what they hear from playtest feedback. I bet, unless it's really diametric, right? This is like 40,000, and it was 40,000. I think they had like 500,000 downloads, but it was 40,000 people that replied to the survey. So the last survey result, I think they said it was 40,000 people.
40,000. What did I say? 400.
400,000. Yeah.
I was in the vicinity.
There was a 4.
Yeah. There was a 4. There was a 4 and a bunch of zeros.
It was a bunch of people in chat that brought that up.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Well, it's not me picking on it, it's them. I'm with you. 400 sounds fine to me.
Yeah, great. Perfect.
But I'm glad we have the opportunity. But I think the playtest is, I don't know, it's fine, right? Like I'm glad we're watching it happen, and it's better than the alternative. It's better than only Shawn gets to test it and then we get 4E again. Right.
Come on, Shawn is a self-critic enough without us playing into him constantly.
And to be fair, if only one person could play test material that then the rest of us also had to play, I'd rather it be Shawn.
That's very true. Absolutely.
A quick welcome. I think it was Luna's channel that raided into us, so we got a couple more people in the chat. I think it was Luna's, but welcome. Correct me if I got that wrong too. If I can push out time, I just want to ask one more question because we've kind of touched on it very briefly, which is around the virtual tabletop stuff and their apparent push to digitize 5e or D&D in some capacity, make it more palatable for a computer to sort of interact with. Because this seems, again, to draw the 4e comparison, to be the same thing they tried with 4E that didn't work for them. And as Matt Colville pointed out when he was on this podcast, there were very specific reasons why that didn't work at that point in time. There were, it's very, not just the individual circumstances, but also the technology, the circumstances around being in lockdown for 2 years has obviously changed people's attitudes to playing this game digitally in some capacity. How do we feel are we excited for seeing how that turns out? Do we predict success, if we shall be so bold?
I'm not excited, but that might, damned with faint praise, that might be the most that I can offer at this point.
I'm very worried about it, and I wasn't worried about it until recently when I started to run games where I was using a lot of third-party content, specifically third-party player content, and my players were so wired around D&D Beyond that it became a real struggle to say like, hey, let's play with, and in this case it was Toma Heroes and Midgard Heroes from Kobold Press, and I was like, let's try these other books. And they were willing to try the other stuff, but they were like, that's fine, but I'm going to like write it into D&D Beyond. And then I would say like, okay, but we're not going to use Xanathar's and Tasha's. We're just going to use Player's Handbook plus these two books. And it was very easy for people to screw up and pick spells and pick subclasses and stuff like that from books that we had said we agreed upon. And then I'm the bad guy for saying, you just picked a subclass that's in Xanathar's Guide, or you picked a spell that's from Xanathar's Guide, and we were trying to use spells from these other books. So it's become very difficult for people who are wired around D&D Beyond, which from my own kind of, terribly scientific surveys is about half of people, right? Half of the people that I surveyed are using D&D Beyond, and about half aren't. That for the half that are, it really locks them down to just what Wizards provides, which is going to be like, what do they do? Are they still going to have the old books when One D&D is out, right? Like, are they going to offer the subclasses from Fizzbands when the new book is out or not, right? I don't know how that's going to work. Now, the other side is like, we still have Roll20, we still have Fantasy Grounds, we still have all these other VTTs. Then the question is, well, will Wizards of the Coast license the new version of D&D to them? There's only two companies right now, two third-party companies that have the license to 5th edition products, and that's Fantasy Grounds and Roll20. I would not be shocked if Wizards said, why, if we have our own VTT, because they didn't have a VTT before, so they didn't matter. But if they could very well say, well, now we do have our VTT, we're not going to hand them our IP. Why would we do that? And so then you are locked down with this one platform. And then it really does become much more video gaming, which is kind of the thing we always use as sort of almost a slur when it comes to D&D. As like, it becomes this video game thing where it's like, oh, you want to play D&D, you have to use D&D Beyond. And we saw it a little bit with the Spelljammer box set, that I went to the store like a good citizen and I bought my copy of Spelljammer, and my books were out of date 1 week later, right?
Yeah.
Like within a week, they had an errata out, and the errata was instantly online on D&D Beyond. And my version, there was, I think I looked it up. There's about 12 changes that they made. There's obviously big ones that were not just mechanically things that I think that changing it was very good, but they changed mechanical stuff too. They were like, oh, well, we're there, we'll muck around with some mechanics. And so now I have books that's $70 sitting on the shelf that are out of date. I don't know what that means when we look at the future for One D&D.
Yeah,
totally.
It
does worry me, because it worries me because it's something that affected me in my game. It's like, I always feel like DMs have the ultimate sort of power to decide what D&D is. Like, they can't come to my house and take my books away, right? They can't make me, I can choose when I'm going to house rule. I can choose which books we're going to allow, which books we're not going to allow. I can decide what kind of themes, what campaigns. I get to decide all of that. I get to decide which version I'm going to play. So I was like, as long as I still have that, I'm good. But when I had players that were so wired around D&D Beyond that it was like a real struggle just to say, like, we're just adding these other two books, that tells me like, wow, it says D&D Beyond is really good. Right, like, it's really, really sticky, because people they much prefer using D&D Beyond to paper character sheets. But I can still say it. I did it for my Sunday game where I said, like, let's just go back to paper character sheets again, and they're like, okay, all right, we'll use paper character sheets again. So that was my result.
One. Is D&D in a better place to make a virtual tabletop than they were at the start of 4th edition? Absolutely. They've got more people, they've got more money, they've got the attention of Hasbro. The technology will support it much better. Everything's A-okay on that front. Is it better for the game? And is it better for a game to be developed in a way that will work better on the tabletop? Your mileage is going to vary depending on who you are and what you want out of your game. To be able to sit down on your phone and play in a 1 hour game really quickly is great for some people. For the people that want to sit down with friends around a table and have a social visit and then play for 4 hours, is it better for them? Not necessarily, but maybe. And that's when I read these rules, these new packets that come out, I am looking at the game design wording. Why are they capitalizing all these words? Right? I'm looking at all of that. But for the most part, I'm stepping back and saying, is the direction of the game going to change based on what we're seeing? And we've only seen 2 packets. We don't know. But it's something that's always going to be on my radar.
Well, with that, we have gone a little bit over time. Thank you for joining us, chat, and from Luna LeBoffin's stream as well. I apologize, Luna. I just don't know how Twitch works, so I didn't know how to know who was raiding into us. Thank you so much for joining us. If you are listening to this on YouTube, as with the YouTube episode releases about 2 days after, or it is also on your podcast apps, make sure to give it a like if you're listening to it on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel. 5-star ratings, all that good stuff helps get us out to more listeners. To PAX. Yes, thank you, Dael. Yes, Dael, myself, and James Hake will all be at PAX. We have a panel at 12:30 on the Sunday. This is PAX Australia, I should clarify, which is this coming weekend. We have a panel on the Sunday at 12:30 with Phil Beckwith, who's a project lead at Ghostfire Gaming, talking about authoring adventures. Which is really James Hake and Phil Beckwith are going to talk about authoring adventures, and Dael and I are there to make up the cast. And then at 3:30 on that same day, 2 hours after, we have a live play with Matthew Perkins and Luna LeBoffin, where we are sailing the stars of the ethereal expanse, playing on the Arcane Forge table. So looking forward to that. I'll also be on the show floor the whole weekend. Come by the Ghostfire Gaming booth on the Friday. I'll be there in the afternoon or on the Sunday morning. Dael, do you have any specific plans for PAX?
I do. I'm on a million different panels, and so I probably should have prepped this ahead of time. I know
you've got a busy weekend.
Yeah, I'm on a panel on Friday. I think like 1 p.m. I'm going to be playing Microscope with Zach from I Speak Giant and a bunch of other cool people. I know that on Friday night, I'm doing a panel that's talking about kind of YouTube and the realities of making YouTube videos within the gaming sort of sphere. I've got one on Saturday that I think is with Generosity that we're doing kind of roulette. Everyone dies very quickly and then you get handed a new character sheet and have to come up with who the character is on the fly. And I think that's happening around 1:30 in the afternoon, and then the ones that you just mentioned. So come say hi.
Cool. Come say hi at PAX Oz. I'm really looking forward to this year getting back. This is the first PAX Oz in 2 years. So
this is my first PAX Oz ever.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Yeah. There's going to be a lot of excitement around it. So please do come say hi. Mike Shea, thank you so much for being on this episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. Where can people find you if they're looking for more of your wisdom?
All of my nonsense is at slyflourish.com. If you go there, you'll see links to my YouTube channel and podcast and newsletter and all my books and everything else. So you can find it all on slyflourish.com.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you so much again. This has been the Eldritch Lorecast. Come back next week. We're here every week streaming at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard, 10 a.m. Australia, Tuesday for Australia, Monday evenings, afternoons for the US time zones. God, this is so complicated to get this all out. My name's Ben Byrne. I've been here with Shawn Merwin, Mike Shea, Dael Kingsmill, and we will see you all next week. Enter the acapella. Oh, Mike, you seem to be having problems. Are you struggling? It's all right. The moment's passed.